Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the final stages of a massive US-India trade pact, and more importantly, the monumental legal earthquake that basically made bilateral agreements like this the new reality. If you've been following international trade, you already know the landscape is shifting incredibly fast right now. But right behind those daily headlines about diplomatic handshakes, there is a deep, foundational constitutional framework actually driving these moves. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the US-India trade breakthrough, the recent Supreme Court tariff verdict, the limits of executive power, how they're aligning the tariff structures, and finally, the strategic road ahead. Starting right off with Section 1, the US-India trade breakthrough. Okay, let's look at exactly how fast things are moving right now. India and the United States are currently in Washington, D.C., engaged in some highly positive, very productive talks. Their singular goal here is finalizing the first phase of a major, mutually beneficial bilateral trade agreement. And the diplomatic momentum is seriously surging. It all kicked off with a February 7th interim framework announcement, which set the rules for reciprocal trade. Then we saw a recent, highly significant phone call between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Trump that really revived the progress. Which brings us directly to the current high-level D.C. talks being led by senior commerce official Darpan Jain for India and Brendan Lynch for the U.S. Trade Representative. All of this momentum, it's perfectly setting the stage for an expected visit by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in May. The optimism in the room is palpable. You've got the U.S. Ambassador to India, Sergio Gore, calling this progress a great step and literally a win-win for both nations. Meanwhile, India's Union Minister Piyush Goyal pointed out that negotiators are deep in the weeds right now, just crossing the T's and dotting the I's on the mechanism that will grant India preferential market access over its competitors. But to really grasp why they are pushing so incredibly hard for this specific, structured agreement right now, we kind of have to peel back the layers of U.S. law. That brings us to Section 2, the Supreme Court tariff verdict. To fully understand why formal, bilateral agreements are the absolute crucial mechanism right now, we have to look at a major disruption in U.S. trade policy under Donald Trump. And this isn't just about trade. This is fundamentally about the constitutional mechanics of how America does business with the world. Earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a significant blow to President Trump's global tariff regime. They struck it down in a highly decisive 6-3 verdict. Now, this wasn't just some narrow legal technicality. A 6-3 decision sends a very clear, undeniably loud message about the legal boundaries of the executive branch when dealing with international commerce. So, what did they actually say? Well, the core of this ruling established a very strict legal boundary. It firmly stated that the executive branch simply does not possess the legal authority to unilaterally levy sweeping global tariffs using emergency powers. For years, the actual scope of emergency powers in trade was heavily debated. Well, this ruling definitively answers that debate. If a president wants to impose far-reaching import duties, they absolutely cannot just bypass Congress anymore.
Moving on to Section 3, Limits of Executive Power.
This verdict is a real game changer. It fundamentally alters the mechanics of American economic negotiations because it clarifies, without a shadow of a doubt, exactly who holds the constitutional power over tariffs. Look at the stark contrast here. We are shifting away from unilateral executive action and fast, legally vulnerable emergency powers. Instead, the Supreme Court firmly shifted the mandate back to congressional approval and constitutionally mandated lawmaker authority. So the era of enacting sweeping global tariffs with just the stroke of a pen is legally restricted. This legal backdrop? It's the invisible hand guiding the current negotiations with India. The judges were remarkably explicit in their reasoning, too. They warned that far-reaching economic decisions of this magnitude must come from lawmakers and not unilateral executive action. This is all about ensuring a strict constitutional check and balance on international trade. So basically, if the executive branch wants to reshape global trade, they can't just impose blanket tariffs on a whim anymore. They have to sit down, negotiate, and make structured deals that align with broader legal frameworks.
Which leads perfectly into Section 4, Aligning the Tariff Structures.
Because sweeping unilateral tariffs are now legally restricted by the highest court in the land, formalizing agreements, like the US-India deal, is quite literally the necessary mechanism moving forward. This is why negotiators like Darpan Jain and Brendan Lynch have such specific goals right now. They're working to attain preferential market access for Indian exports. They're developing reciprocal and mutually beneficial frameworks. They are laser-focused on reducing bilateral trade barriers. And perhaps most importantly, they are doing the hard work to align tariff structures in a way that economically benefits both respective economies, rather than relying on unilateral emergency declarations.
Finally, Section 5, the strategic road ahead.
Now that most of the heavy lifting is done and they are just tying up loose ends, what comes next? Well, with the legal mandate crystal clear and the trade deal entering its final stage, we look to the horizon. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to visit India in May. And to be clear, this is not just some ceremonial trip. The goal is to further solidify this strategic and economic engagement. By locking in this trade agreement, the U.S. and India are laying down the concrete foundation for much broader cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. Trade is really acting as the vanguard for the larger strategic alliance here.
So that leaves us with one incredibly compelling question to think about. As unilateral tariffs face these strict legal limits, how will this constitutional mandate for congressional approval permanently reshape the mechanics of America's economic alliances across the globe? Are we going to see a massive surge in complex bilateral agreements just like this one with India? As the rules of the game change, understanding this legal foundation is really the only way to predict the future of global trade. Keep your eyes on Washington, keep an eye on New Delhi, and think about how those scales of constitutional power continue to balance out. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.